It was late evening when the streets had grown quiet, the rush of the day slowly dying down. The city lights flickered against the pavement, casting long shadows of passing cars and people rushing home. On the corner near an old bus stop, a man sat alone. His clothes were worn out, his shoes barely holding together, and beside him was a torn backpack that seemed to carry the little he owned in the world. His face carried lines of hardship, the kind that only years of struggle could carve. To most people walking past, he was invisible. Another homeless man. Someone not worth a second glance. 2 police officers were patrolling the area, their steps slow but confident. They were used to dealing with people on the streets, and often their patience was thin. When their eyes landed on the man sitting quietly at the bus stop, they exchanged looks, as if they had found a small problem to fix in their otherwise boring night. To them, he wasn't a man resting. He was loitering, a word they often used when they wanted to push someone away. "Hey, you." One of the officers called out, his voice sharp. The man looked up, but didn't answer. His eyes were calm, steady, but his silence seemed to annoy the officer even more. The other officer stepped closer, shaking his head. "You can't sit here. Move along. This isn't your spot." The man didn't argue. He simply shifted slightly, adjusting the strap of his bag. His body language wasn't threatening. It was almost peaceful. But his refusal to jump up immediately made the officers feel like he was ignoring their authority. That, for them, was enough reason to push harder. "Did you hear me?" the first officer snapped, taking a step forward. "Get up. Now. Still." The man didn't rise. He wasn't defiant in the usual sense. There was no anger in his eyes, no rebellious grin. Instead, there was something unusual and unshakable calmness, like he had faced situations far more dangerous than this one. But the officers didn't notice it. To them, his silence looked like disrespect. One of the cops leaned closer, his hand resting near his holster, though there was no real threat in front of him. "What's in the bag?" he demanded, pointing to the old backpack at the man's side. The man didn't flinch. Slowly, he placed his hand on the bag protectively, not out of aggression, but out of instinct. It was the only thing he owned, the only constant in a world that had stripped him of almost everything. The officers read his gesture differently. They exchanged suspicious looks, convincing themselves that maybe this homeless man was hiding something illegal. Pedestrians passed by without interfering. Some pretended not to notice. Some walked faster, while a few slowed down to watch from a safe distance. It was not unusual for people to see police confronting a homeless man, and sadly, it was not unusual for them to stay silent. The taller officer smirked. "You think you can just sit here, huh? Like this is your living room?" His voice dripped with sarcasm. The other officer chuckled, adding, "What's the matter? Cat, got your tongue?" The man finally spoke, his voice low but clear. "I'm not bothering anyone. I just need a place to sit." His tone wasn't aggressive. It was almost gentle. But instead of calming the situation, his words only seemed to fuel the officer's irritation. "Not bothering anyone." The first cop repeated mockingly. "You're sitting here looking suspicious, and now you're talking back. Don't play smart with us." The man fell silent again, his eyes steady, almost unblinking. There was a quiet strength in the way he looked at them. It wasn't the strength of someone trying to pick a fight. It was the strength of someone who had seen much worse than 2 officers barking orders. But once again, they didn't see it. They only saw what they wanted to see. A homeless man who wasn't obeying fast enough. The tension grew heavier. A car slowed down as it passed, the driver curious about the scene. A couple stopped a few feet away, whispering to each other, sensing the hostility in the air. The officers, aware they were being watched, straightened their shoulders, as if to show the public that they were in control. The man adjusted his posture, sitting a little straighter now. His eyes flicked around, scanning the street, the people, the officer's stance. It was a habit he couldn't let go of, one born from years of training and discipline. Every environment, every sound, every movement had to be assessed. He wasn't afraid of the cops, but he wasn't careless either. The officers mistook his measured calmness for arrogance. "You think you're better than us?" one snapped. The man didn't answer. He didn't need to. His silence was louder than any words he could have spoken. And so the street encounter began not as a dramatic clash of fists or shouts, but as a quiet standoff. On one side, two officers fueled by assumptions, treating the man as less than human. On the other, a man who carried a history far greater than anyone around him could imagine. A man who had once been respected, feared, and relied upon in life or death. Situations now reduced in the eyes of the world to just another homeless guy. The air around them felt charged, like a storm waiting to break. The crowd, small but growing, could sense that something wasn't ordinary about this scene. They couldn't place it yet, but there was something in the homeless man's eyes, something deep, controlled, and unshakable. Something that suggested he was not who they thought he was. The officers stepped closer, their boots echoing against the cracked pavement. The homeless man Marcus sat still, almost statuesque, as if he had rooted himself into that bus stop bench. His calmness bothered them more than if he had yelled or cursed. Silence, in moments like these, could feel like defiance. "Didn't I tell you to move?" the taller officer said, his voice sharper now, trying to cut through the heavy stillness. He jabbed a finger toward the street. "Go. Find somewhere else." Marcus slowly raised his eyes, meeting the officer's glare without blinking. "I'm not hurting anyone," he said softly, his voice deep but steady. His tone wasn't one of challenge, but it carried a quiet firmness. The second officer let out a short laugh, a mocking chuckle. "You hear that? He says he's not hurting anyone sitting here with that bag, looking like trouble, and he wants us to believe he's harmless." He circled Marcus like a predator, leaning down to get a better look at his face. "What's in the bag? Drugs? Stolen stuff? Or maybe weapons?" Marcus didn't move. He placed one hand on his bag, not with aggression, but with the instinct of a man protecting the little he owned. "It's mine," he said. "That's all," the first officer sneered. "Everything's yours until we check. You think you can just sit here and make up your own rules? You don't own this sidewalk. You don't even look like you own a place to sleep." His words were cutting, designed to strip Marcus of dignity, to remind him of his position in society. Pedestrians began to slow down. Some turned their heads away, not wanting to get involved. Others lingered at a safe distance, sensing that something was building. A mother pulled her child closer, whispering something about not staring. To the growing onlookers, the situation looked familiar: cops versus a homeless man. Most assumed it would end the way such encounters usually did, with the man forced to leave. Humiliated, maybe even handcuffed. The second officer stepped closer and gave Marcus's bag a little kick with his boot. "Stand up," he ordered. Now, Marcus stayed seated. He didn't flinch, didn't protest, didn't raise his voice. His silence had weight, a kind of gravity that made the officers more uneasy than they cared to admit. They were used to yelling, begging, excuses, even insults. But this man gave them none of that. "You deaf or just stupid?" the first officer barked. He reached down and shoved Marcus's shoulder roughly. The crowd let out a soft, collective gasp, but no one moved to interfere. People were afraid of getting involved with the police. Marcus steadied himself from the shove, but his eyes remained locked on the officer's face. There was no fear there, no anger, just a quiet steadiness that unsettled the men towering over him. For a split second, the officer hesitated. Something about that gaze didn't belong to a broken man on the streets. It belonged to someone who had seen far darker things than a city sidewalk confrontation. But pride pushed hesitation aside. The second officer leaned down again. "Listen here, old man. You either get up or we'll make you. Your choice." Marcus breathed slowly, keeping his voice calm. "You don't need to push me around. I'm not your enemy." The words hung in the air, strange in their simplicity. Not an enemy. The officers laughed, dismissing it, but those who listened carefully felt the weight of what he said. Like that. Not your average homeless man. The taller cop's face twisted with irritation. "Enemy. Don't play games with me. You're nobody. Just another bum sitting where you don't belong." He glanced toward the crowd, aware they were watching, and his voice rose louder, fueled by the desire to assert control. "Get up before I drag you out of here myself." Marcus still didn't rise. He didn't want to cause trouble, but he also wasn't about to let his dignity be stripped away without reason. His stillness was not rebellion, was restraint, the kind only a man trained in discipline could. "Master?" The other officer leaned in, his face inches from Marcus's. "What are you hiding? Why won't you just move along like the rest of them?" Marcus looked at him quietly, and for the first time, he spoke a little louder. His voice calm, but cutting through the night air. "Because I've moved along my whole life. Sometimes a man just needs to sit." The words stopped the officer in his tracks for a moment. There was something in Marcus's tone measured, controlled, almost like a commander speaking to a soldier out of line. It didn't sound like a plea, sounded like truth. But pride, again, was stronger than reason. The cop shoved him once more, harder this time. Marcus gripped the edge of the bench to steady himself. The crowd murmured, uneasy, sensing that something wasn't right here. This wasn't the usual homeless man's behavior. There was no slurring of words, no drunkenness, no fear. Just calm resistance. The taller officer's hand inched toward his baton, not because he needed it, but because he felt the need to remind this man and the crowd of his power. The scene was shifting from a simple order to a public show of dominance, and through it all, Marcus remained still. His silence wasn't weakness. It was strength contained, a storm waiting quietly behind calm eyes. If anyone had looked closely enough, they might have realized it wasn't a homeless man they were trying to break. It was something else entirely. The noise of the city had thinned, yet the tension at that small corner only grew heavier. Marcus sat still, his hands resting on his lap, the old backpack close to his side. Around him, the officers' voices were sharp, but he refused to match their tone. Instead, he answered them with silence, on unshakable, unmovable silence. To the onlookers, that silence looked strange. Most people in Marcus's situation would have argued, begged, or shouted. Some would have cursed the officers, while others would have scrambled away in fear. But Marcus did none of these things. He just sat there, steady as stone, his dark eyes scanning the faces of the men in uniform, then shifting briefly to the growing crowd inside his mind. However, there was no stillness. His silence was not emptiness, was calculation. Years of training had carved that habit into him. When he was a Green Beret, silence had often meant survival. A single breath too loud, a word whispered at the wrong time, could have cost him his life and the lives of those under his protection. He had learned to observe before reacting, to weigh danger before striking. And so, in this moment, he did what he knew best. He watched, he listened, he waited. The taller officer mistook his quietness for arrogance. "You think you're better than us? Too good to answer, huh?" His hand tightened on his baton, itching to prove a point. The second officer leaned down again, trying to provoke. "What's wrong? Cat, got your tongue." Marcus kept his breathing slow, controlled. He thought back to the nights overseas, lying motionless on rocky terrain. His rifle steady in his hands as enemy soldiers passed within feet of him. He had learned the art of patience in places where 1 second could change everything. Compared to that, this moment was small. These men were loud, but they were not true threats, not in the way Marcus understood threats. Yet he also knew one truth. Authority could be dangerous, even if it came in the form of 2 ordinary city cops. They carried the power to escalate, to twist a situation into something that could ruin lives. Marcus had seen enough of the world to know how quickly things could spin out of control. And so, he chose silence, not out of fear, but out of wisdom. The crowd whispered, unsure of what to make of him. Some thought he was mute. Others thought he was defiant. A man in a business suit muttered, "He's just asking for trouble," while an elderly woman shook her head, whispering, "Something about him? He doesn't look broken, not like the others." The officer who had shoved him earlier grew impatient. "Answer me," he barked, his voice echoing against the buildings. Marcus finally spoke, his voice calm, so low it almost disappeared beneath. "The street noise. I've got nothing to say to you." The words were simple, but they carried a weight that surprised even him. They weren't bitter. They weren't aggressive. They were final, like a door shutting in someone's face. The taller officer sneered, unable to stand the calmness. "Oh, you'll talk," he said. "They always talk." Marcus fell silent. Again, his jaw tightening slightly. He was thinking not about the officers, but about himself, about how far he had fallen. There was a time when men in uniform had stood beside him, trusted him with their lives, followed his orders in battle. Back then, silence had been his shield, his weapon, and his gift. Now, it was mistaken for weakness. The irony was bitter. The younger officer, growing restless, leaned closer and hissed, "You don't scare me, old man." Marcus's eyes flicked toward him, and for the briefest second, something sharp glimmered there, a look that was cold, precise, and utterly unshaken. It was the look of a soldier, the look of someone who had seen death and walked away from it too many times. The officer felt it, though he didn't understand why. He shifted uncomfortably, as if his body recognized what his mind refused to. Still, Marcus stayed quiet. He had learned long ago that words could be wasted, that noise could betray you. The best soldiers, the best survivors, knew when silence spoke louder than anything else. Around them, the crowd grew restless. Whispers turned into murmurs, and murmurs into light chatter. People were beginning to sense that this wasn't a normal encounter. Something about the homeless man's silence was different. It wasn't helpless. It wasn't fearful. It was powerful. The taller officer snapped again, shoving Marcus's shoulder once more. This time, Marcus barely moved, his body steady, as if planted firmly into the ground. The officer frowned. He was used to people stumbling, flinching, even crying out. But this man didn't break. And so the silence deepened, not empty, not weak, but alive, thick with unseen history. The officers didn't know it, but in front of them sat one of the most lethal snipers the military had ever trained. A man who had lived through firefights, ambushes, and battles where silence had meant life. To him, this moment was nothing more than noise. And until he chose otherwise, noise would never shake him. The crowd at the bus stop only saw a homeless man holding his silence against 2 impatient officers. To them, Marcus was just another shadow in the city, a nameless face in worn-out clothes. But beneath that weathered exterior lay a story that none of them could have guessed, a story carved in deserts, jungles, and foreign battlefields, thousands of miles away. Marcus Hale had once worn a different kind of uniform. The patches on his shoulder had carried weight. His name had been spoken with respect, and his skill with a rifle had made him a legend among his brothers in arms. In the world he came from, silence was not defiance, was survival. As the officer barked another order, Marcus's mind drifted, unbidden, back to a night far away. The smell of sand and gunpowder filled his memory. He was lying flat on a ridge, the scope of his rifle pressed against his eye. Below him, a convoy of enemy trucks rumbled slowly along a desert road. His breathing was steady, his heart beat calm. He could hear the faint voices of his team through the radio in his ear, waiting for his word. One shot, that was all it would take to stop the convoy, to protect the squad pinned down just a mile away. He pulled the trigger. Silence broke into thunder for only a second, and then the desert fell quiet again. Through his scope, he watched the lead truck grind to a halt, smoke rising from its hood. His team cheered faintly in the distance, but Marcus did not. For him, every shot was not about glory, it was about necessity. He was trained to end chaos with precision, to save lives by taking others. And in that shadowy world, he had become one of the most lethal snipers in Green Beret history. Back in the present, Marcus blinked slowly, dragging himself from the memory. The officer looming over him had no idea that the man he was shoving had once saved entire platoons with a single pull of the trigger. To these men, he was just a bum with a bag. Another flash of memory crept in, this time from the jungle. The air had been thick, damp, and alive with insects. Marcus and his unit had been tracking an insurgent group for days, moving silently under the cover of night. His men were tired, nerves frayed. But Marcus's eyes were sharp, scanning every tree, every shadow. He had spotted movement through the leaves, 3 enemies setting up an ambush. Without hesitation, his rifle spoke in quick, controlled bursts. When the jungle went quiet again, his men knew they owed their lives to his vigilance. He remembered the way his commander had clapped him on the shoulder after that mission, saying, "Hey, you see what no one else can? You hear what no one else hears. That's why you're still alive. That's why we're still alive." Those words had stayed with him, but so had the faces. Too many faces. Not only of the men he saved, but of those he could not. War was not just medals and victories, it was also ghosts. Ones that followed a man long after he put down his weapon. The officer's voice cut through his thoughts again. "What's in the bag, old man? You hiding something?" Marcus's jaw tightened. His bag contained no weapons now, no tools of war. Just scraps of clothing, a blanket, and an old, battered photograph of his unit. In that photo, he was younger, his eyes sharper, his smile faint but present. Standing shoulder to shoulder with men who had trusted him with their lives. Men who are now scattered, some dead, some broken, some still fighting wars they could never leave behind. The second officer tapped his baton against his palm. "I asked you a question. What's in the bag?" Marcus didn't answer. How could he explain that inside that bag was the last piece of a life he once lived? That he wasn't just a nameless drifter, but a soldier who had given everything for a country that no longer saw him. His silence wasn't just about the officers, it was about the years of carrying stories too heavy to share. The crowd, sensing the officer's growing aggression, shifted uneasily. But Marcus remained calm, his body still, his eyes distant. If anyone had looked closer, they would have seen that his silence wasn't weakness. It was the same silence that had carried him through missions, through loss, through fire and smoke and death. Marcus had once been a man whose name carried weight in military briefings, whose skills had been whispered about with awe. The most lethal Green Beret sniper in history, that was the reputation that followed him in circles few civilians would ever know. Yet here he sat, unrecognized, dismissed as a nuisance. To the officers, Marcus was invisible. To the world, he was forgotten. But deep inside, he still carried the instincts of a soldier, the eyes that never stopped scanning. the mind that never stopped calculating, the spirit that refused to be broken. And though he sat silently, letting the harassment continue, the truth was simple. Marcus Hale was not the man they thought he was. He was something far more dangerous. When Marcus left the military, he thought the hardest battles were behind him. He had survived deserts, jungles, ambushes, and nights when death crept close enough to whisper in his ear. He had seen comrades fall beside him, had carried the weight of decisions no man should ever have to make, and had lived to tell the story. But what he did not know was that the war inside him would be the longest and most unforgiving one of all. At first, he tried to adjust. He wore civilian clothes, walked into grocery stores, and told himself that this was normal life now. But his body refused to let go of the habits drilled into him. His eyes scanned every aisle, every door, every face. His hands twitched. At sudden noises, his chest tightened when cars backfired. And nights were the worst, when silence was broken by memories that clawed their way back into his dreams. Sleep never came easy. Some nights he would jolt awake, drenched in sweat, his hands gripping the edge of the bed as if it were the stock of his rifle. Other nights, he would stay awake until dawn, afraid of what his mind would show him if he closed his eyes. His neighbors saw him as strange, the quiet veteran who kept to himself. They didn't see the battles raging inside his head. Marcus had a wife once. Her name was Elaine. She had written him letters during his deployments, each one filled with hope, with prayers, with reminders of home. When he returned after his last tour, she had rushed into his arms, holding him as if she could keep him from slipping away again. But she soon realized the man who came back was not the same man who left. He was distant, distracted, his eyes always searching the room as though danger lingered in every shadow. He forgot birthdays, forgot conversations, sometimes even forgot to eat. Elaine tried to help. She begged him to see someone, to talk about what haunted him. But Marcus couldn't. Words felt heavy, clumsy. How could he describe the weight of faces that never left his mind? How could he tell her about the silence that screamed louder than any gunfire? Their marriage began to fray. Arguments replaced laughter. Nights ended with slammed doors instead of whispered goodnights. Marcus hated himself for it, but he didn't know how to fix it. The distance grew, until one day, Elaine left. She packed a small bag and walked out with tears in her eyes whispering, "I can't reach you anymore." That was the day Marcus realized he had lost not just a wife, but the last anchor keeping him steady in civilian life. He tried to find work, but who would hire a man who flinched at every loud sound, who froze when crowds pressed too close? He tried office jobs, but the walls felt suffocating. He tried construction, but the pounding of machinery sent him spiraling back to the battlefield. He tried security, but he couldn't stand the way people looked at him with suspicion, as though sensing the weight of his past. Money dried up. His savings, what little he had, disappeared into rent, into food, into attempts to numb the nightmares. With bottles he regretted in the morning, friends drifted away. Family members shook their heads, telling him to get over it. And slowly, Marcus slipped through the cracks. The first night he slept on the streets, he told himself it was temporary. Just one night, until he figured something out. But one night turned into two, then weeks, then months. The city became both his enemy and his home. Park benches became beds. Soup kitchens became his only reliable meals. Winter nights became battles of survival as he huddled under thin blankets, his body shaking from cold more than fear. Yet, even in the depths of his fall, the discipline never left him. He never begged loudly, never caused trouble. He carried himself with quiet dignity, even when people spit insults at him or walked past as if he were invisible. His silence remained his armor. People only saw a homeless man. They didn't see The soldier who had once been the sharpest eye on the battlefield. The man whose steady hands had changed the course of missions, whose silence had saved lives. They didn't see the war hero. They only saw the aftermath. Marcus carried one thing. With him everywhere, an old, worn photograph tucked safely in his backpack. In it, his unit stood shoulder to shoulder, grinning despite the dirt on their faces, the exhaustion in their eyes. He looked at it often, not for glory, but as a reminder that once he belonged. Once he mattered, and now, sitting on that bench as two officers towered over him, Marcus carried all those years in his silence. They mocked him, shoved him, treated him as if he were nothing. But inside, he carried a past that would have stunned them into silence. A past that made their threats look like dust compared to the storms he had already endured. Marcus Hale was homeless, yes, but he was not broken. He was still a soldier, even if the world had forgotten. The night air had grown heavier. What began as a routine patrol stop was slowly turning into a spectacle. The two officers circled Marcus like wolves circling prey, their voices rising with every command, every insult, every shove. Yet Marcus remained still, steady, unshaken. His calmness, instead of diffusing the tension, only seemed to feed the officer's frustration. "Get up," the taller one shouted, his voice cracking with authority he was desperate to assert. He jabbed his baton toward Marcus's chest, the rubber tip pressing against the worn fabric of his jacket. "I said move." Marcus lifted his eyes, meeting the officer's glare with a look so calm it almost seemed unnatural. His voice, when he finally spoke, was low and deliberate. "There's no need for this." That only enraged the cop more. "No need. You don't tell me what's needed." He shoved the baton harder, forcing Marcus to lean back slightly. The crowd murmured, uneasy now. Some had their phones out, recording. Others whispered to each other. Sensing that something was building, the younger officer stepped in, his hand already resting on his taser. "Sir, this is your last warning," he said mockingly, though his tone carried an edge of uncertainty. There was something in Marcus's eyes he couldn't shake. Not anger, not fear, but a kind of control that didn't belong to a man they thought was powerless. Marcus didn't move. His silence, his stillness, was louder than their threats. It unsettled them because it was not the silence of defeat. It was the silence of discipline, of a man who knew exactly how much power he held back. The taller cop, growing impatient, shoved Marcus hard this time. The bench scraped against the concrete as Marcus steadied himself. Gasps rose from the onlookers. One woman whispered, "Why doesn't he fight back?" Another answered softly, "Because he doesn't need to." Marcus's mind was alive though. His body remained calm. His instincts screamed at him. The old reflexes of a sniper honed in fire and blood. Every movement of the officers, every shift of their weight, every nervous flicker of their eyes. He registered it all in silence. He knew exactly how to disarm them, how to end this in seconds if he chose to. But he didn't. He had fought enough battles to know that not every fight was worth pulling the trigger for. Still, his patience was not endless. The younger officer grew bolder, stepping even closer, until his face was inches from Marcus's. "You think you can stare me down? You think you scare me? You're nothing, old man." His voice cracked slightly, betraying nerves he didn't want to admit. Marcus leaned forward just enough for his words to cut between them. "If you knew who I was, you wouldn't be standing this close." The officer froze. The words were soft, almost whispered, but there was no mistaking their weight. He blinked, trying to read the man's expression, but Marcus's face was steady, unreadable. Carved from stone, the taller cop laughed mockingly to cover the moment of unease. "Oh yeah, and who were you supposed to be? Some war hero? Don't make me laugh." He pushed Marcus again, harder this time. his frustration spilling over. Marcus's hands tightened slightly on the edge of the bench. For the first time, a flicker of heat burned in his chest. He breathed deeply, steadying himself, reminding himself of the discipline drilled into him. Do not engage unless necessary. Do not strike unless there is no other choice. His old commander's voice echoed in his mind, a reminder of restraint. But the crowd saw it a shift, subtle but unmistakable. The calm man's silence now carried an edge, like a coiled spring stretched too far. A few people stepped back, sensing that the air around them had changed. The younger officer, perhaps sensing the same thing, hesitated. His hand hovered near his taser, but he didn't draw it. He glanced at his partner, unsure. Something about the way Marcus sat there, unbroken, unmoved, unsettled him in ways he couldn't explain. The taller officer, however, was too far gone in his need to prove dominance. Stand up, or I'll put you on the ground myself, he barked. Marcus lifted his eyes again, and for the briefest moment, the mask of silence cracked just enough to show a glimpse of the man beneath. His gaze sharpened, his posture straightened. And in that instant, he didn't look like a homeless man anymore. He looked like something else entirely, a soldier, a predator. A man who had once been feared on battlefields where silence meant death. The officer took an involuntary step back before catching himself. He forced a laugh, trying to cover his own unease. But the crowd noticed. They saw how a simple look had shaken a man in uniform. Marcus closed his eyes for a moment, breathing deeply, as if pulling himself back from a line he didn't want to cross. His silence was no longer just defiance, it was mercy. He was holding back, and though no one around him fully understood it, they felt it. The weight of it hung in the air, thick and suffocating. The tension had escalated beyond repair. This was no longer about a homeless man at a bus stop. It was something else now, something bigger. The officers, the crowd, even Marcus himself could feel it, and somewhere deep inside. Marcus knew the storm was far from over. The crowd around the bus stop had grown larger. Phones were raised higher, red recording lights glowing like watchful eyes. Whispers turned into conversations, and conversations into murmurs of unease. The confrontation was no longer between two officers and a homeless man. It had become a spectacle. A scene where truth and tension hung in the air like smoke before a fire. The taller officer shoved Marcus again, harder than before, hoping to finally provoke a reaction. Marcus leaned slightly but steadied himself. Without rising, his hands stayed on his lap, his silence steady as a drumbeat. His calmness now felt unnatural, eerie even, to those watching. From the crowd, a voice broke the hum of whispers. Wait. It was an older man, dressed in a faded jacket, his face worn but alert. He stepped forward slowly, pushing through the bodies until he stood near the front. His eyes, sharp with recognition, locked onto Marcus. For a moment, his breath caught in his throat. No, the man muttered, almost to himself. Then louder, I know you. The officers turned their heads sharply, their irritation spilling into their tone. Step back, sir. This doesn't concern you. But the man ignored them. His eyes stayed on Marcus, wide with disbelief. You're Hale. Marcus Hale. The name hung in the air like a stone dropped into still water, sending ripples through the crowd. The officers frowned, confused. Marcus did not answer, did not confirm, nor deny. His eyes narrowed slightly, but his silence was telling enough. The older man shook his head in wonder. I served. Afghanistan, 2003. We heard about you. Everyone did. They said you were a ghost in the field, the sniper who never missed. His voice trembled with emotion. They called you the most lethal Green Beret in history. Gasps rippled through the onlookers. Phones lifted higher, recording every word. The officers exchanged uneasy glances. Suddenly less certain of the ground they stood on. The taller cop scoffed nervously, trying to reclaim authority. "Don't believe everything you hear. He's just a homeless guy. Look at him." But the older man shook his head fiercely. "I know that face. You don't forget a legend. I remember hearing the stories, missions where squads were pinned down and survived because one man was covering them from the shadows. Shots taken from distances so impossible that they became myth. That was you, wasn't it?" The crowd leaned in. The murmurs grew louder. People were no longer looking at Marcus with pity. They were looking at him with awe. Marcus finally lifted his head, his eyes meeting the older man's. For the first time all night, a flicker of something passed through his face, not pride, not arrogance, but a quiet acknowledgement. He didn't need to say yes. His silence confirmed what words could not. The younger officer shifted uncomfortably, his hand moving away from his taser. He licked his lips nervously, suddenly aware that the man they had been mocking and shoving might not only be more dangerous than they realized, but also someone whose name carried weight far beyond this street corner. The older man stepped closer to the bench, his voice louder now, his words aimed at both the officers and the crowd. "You're treating him like trash, but this man saved lives, more than you could count. He fought for this country while the rest of us slept safely in our beds, and this is how you treat him." His voice cracked, filled with both anger and sorrow. The taller cop bristled. "Enough. Step back before I—" But the words caught in his throat. The crowd's energy had shifted. Where moments ago they were passive observers, now they were restless, emboldened. Their eyes burned with disapproval. Some shouted, "Leave him alone." Others muttered words like hero, veteran, Green Beret. Marcus sat still, but inside, his chest tightened. He hadn't wanted this, hadn't wanted recognition, didn't want to be dragged back into the legend he'd tried to leave behind. He lived quietly in the shadows because he no longer felt like a hero. But now his truth was laid bare for all to see. The taller officer's face turned red. Authority was slipping from his grip, the crowd against him, the weight of the revelation. Pressing hard, he tried to laugh it off, shaking his head. "I don't care who he was. Right now, he's nothing but..." Marcus's eyes snapped open, sharp and cold, cutting the words off before they were finished. The look he gave the officer wasn't loud, wasn't violent, but it carried the force of every battlefield he'd ever walked, every life he'd ever taken to protect his own. The officer's words died in his throat. For the first time, he felt fear. Not of a homeless man, but of a predator who had once lived in the crosshairs of war. The silence that followed was heavier than any shout. The crowd felt it. The officers felt it, and Marcus knew the truth was no longer hidden. The world now saw not a homeless man, but a forgotten warrior. Asterisk. The air had changed. What had started as an ordinary street harassment had transformed into something else entirely, a reckoning. The officers who just moments ago had laughed and shoved Marcus like he was nothing, now stood stiffly there, authority slipping away under the weight of the truth. The name Marcus Hale echoed in whispers through the crowd. People muttered to each other, some in disbelief, others in awe. He's a veteran, a Green Beret, the most lethal sniper. The more the word spread, the more the energy shifted. The younger officer stepped back slightly, his hand no longer near his taser. His eyes darted between Marcus and the crowd, sensing that they had crossed a line they couldn't retreat from. The taller officer, red-faced and stubborn, tried to hold on to control. But his voice lacked its earlier edge when he muttered, "Hero or not, he shouldn't be enough." The word didn't come from Marcus. It came from the crowd. A young woman holding her phone out shouted it, her voice trembling with anger. Then another man added, "Leave him alone." And another, "Show some respect." Voices rose like a wave, the crowd no longer just observing but defending. For the first time, the officers were outnumbered, not in bodies, but in spirit. Their power, once unquestioned, was crumbling under the weight of public disapproval. Marcus sat silently, his face unreadable, but inside he felt something shift. He had been invisible for so long, dismissed by everyone who walked past. Now, people were standing for him, not because he asked them to, but because truth demanded it. The older veteran in the crowd stepped forward again, his voice trembling but firm. This man bled for this country. He gave years of his life to protect strangers he'll never meet. And now he's treated like dirt because he's on the streets. You ought to be ashamed. The taller officer opened his mouth, but the words wouldn't come. He looked at Marcus, then at the crowd, then at the phones recording every second. Authority had slipped through his hands like sand. Without another word, he lowered his baton and stepped back. His partner followed, avoiding Marcus's gaze. Together, they retreated into the murmuring crowd, their uniforms suddenly looking smaller, less powerful. Silence lingered for a moment after they left, a heavy quiet filled with unspoken emotions. Then slowly, the crowd shifted. People who had once watched from a distance now stepped closer. Not with suspicion, but with respect. A woman set down a bottle of water beside Marcus. "Here," she whispered, her eyes soft. A young man took off his jacket and offered it. "It's cold. Take this." Someone else placed a sandwich in front of him, their hands trembling as if they were unworthy to hand it to him directly. Marcus looked at the offerings with quiet eyes. He did not reach for them immediately. He wasn't used to kindness anymore. But in that moment, he felt something he hadn't felt in years. Seeing the older veteran crouch down, lowering himself so. His eyes were level with Marcus's brother. He said softly, his voice breaking, "You shouldn't be out here. You deserve better." Marcus finally spoke, his words heavy but calm. "Deserve doesn't mean much out here." He glanced at the crowd, then back at the veteran. "But, thank you." The people around him fell silent, as if those two words carried more weight than any speech could. It wasn't just gratitude, it was acknowledgement. A soldier who had carried burdens in silence was finally letting the world see a glimpse of his humanity. The cameras kept rolling, the videos already destined to spread across screens by morning. But for those who stood there in the flesh, the moment was more than viral content. It was history. It was a reminder that the heroes who once protected the country walked among them unseen, often forgotten and sometimes even mistreated, as the crowd slowly began to disperse. A few lingered near Marcus, unwilling to leave him alone. The woman with the water bottle stayed close, her eyes watchful. The young man with the jacket insisted Marcus keep it. The older veteran placed a hand on his shoulder, a silent brotherhood passing between them. Marcus sat quietly through it all, his backpack resting against his leg. Inside was the same worn photograph of his unit, men who had trusted him, followed him, and in many ways lived because of him. He thought of them as he sat surrounded by strangers who now looked at him with respect instead of disdain. For the first time in years, Marcus felt the weight on his shoulders ease, not gone, but lighter. He wasn't a hero in his own eyes. He was just a man who had done what needed to be done and paid the price afterward. But tonight, for a brief moment, he was reminded that he wasn't forgotten. That even in the darkest corners of the city, respect could still be restored. He didn't smile. Marcus Hale wasn't the kind of man to grin at the world. But his eyes softened, and for those close enough to see, it was enough. The storm had passed, but its memory would remain. And as Marcus sat on that bench, Silent as ever, the world around him finally saw not a homeless man, not a nuisance, but a soldier, a warrior, a man who had once been and still was far greater than anyone had realized.